The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the respectful kind you expect at a funeral, but the cold, suffocating kind that makes you wonder if you should have stayed home. I stood at the back of the room, clutching my purse tighter than I needed to, my heels sinking slightly into the carpet. No one turned to greet me. No one offered a seat. It was as if I didn't belong. My husband's photo sat on a small table near the casket, framed in silver. He looked warm in it, gentle. The man I married. But that wasn't the man they had come to remember, not the man they whispered about. That's when I saw her. Vanessa, his daughter from his first marriage. Her blonde hair was pulled back tight, her nails painted a perfect pale pink. She turned her head, saw me, and smiled. Not kindly, not with sympathy. It was a smug, amused smile, as if my presence were some kind of pathetic punchline. And then she laughed. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. Others around her chuckled too. I stood frozen, my face calm, though my heart slammed against my ribs. I felt my cheeks burn, not from shame, but from something deeper. I was grieving a man I had shared my life with for 3 decades, and in that moment, his daughter acted like I was the outsider. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just moved to the corner of the room and sat down in silence. No one offered condolences. No one asked how I was. I folded my hands in my lap and stared at the floor. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Before the bitterness, before the silence, before I found myself seated alone at his funeral, my life with Thomas was quiet. It wasn't the kind of love story that fills novels or makes people envious, but it was mine, and I cherished it. I met Thomas at a library benefit event when I was 32. He had just gone through a divorce, and I had just lost my father. We were both nursing invisible wounds. He liked my calm nature. I liked his sense of order. He said I brought peace into his life. I believed him. When we married, his daughter Vanessa was 12. She stood stiffly in her pale blue dress at our small ceremony and refused to smile in the photos. I tried to love her, even when she made it clear she had no intention of letting me in. I attended her dance recitals, packed her lunches when she visited, and left little notes in her backpack. She threw most of them away, but I kept writing them. Thomas always said, "She'll come around," and I wanted to believe that. I told myself I just needed to be patient. In those early years, our home was filled with small, ordinary joys. Sunday pancakes, gardening in the spring, crossword puzzles at night. Thomas built me a little reading nook by the window. I knitted while he watched the news. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt safe. I used to sit in that nook, legs tucked under me, thinking how lucky I was to have landed in a life that felt so steady. I gave up promotions to be home more often, especially when Vanessa stayed with us during school breaks. I wanted her to feel like she had a real home with us. She never said thank you, but I didn't expect her to. I just wanted to be there. Holidays were more difficult. Vanessa often spent them with her mother, but when she did visit, she barely acknowledged me. One year, I knitted her a scarf in her college colors. She left it behind. Thomas told me not to take it personally. I pretended I didn't. Still, I believed in our life. I believed that one day Thomas would notice all the little things I did. The quiet loyalty, the steady support, the effort I poured into building a home where everyone could feel safe. I believed that if I stayed calm, stayed present, stayed kind, eventually the walls would soften. Thomas could be warm when he wanted to be. He used to leave folded notes on the kitchen counter, just little lines like, "Missed your smile today," or "Dinner was perfect." I saved them all in a box under my nightstand. Sometimes when I couldn't sleep, I'd open that box and run my fingers over the paper. It reminded me that I mattered, that he saw me, but somewhere along the way, those notes stopped. The smiles came less frequently. He started answering Vanessa's calls in another room. I dismissed it as aging stress, Work fatigue, the strain of blended family life. We all make compromises, I told myself. That's what love requires. Still, I stayed. I made coffee each morning. I refilled his blood pressure pills. I kept the kitchen stocked with his favorite snacks, even when he never thanked me. I thought love meant staying consistent, even when things felt uneven. I thought love meant putting others first, even when you felt invisible. And I was invisible. But I didn't see that clearly then, not yet. At night, I still made sure his blanket was pulled up before I turned off the light. When he came down with the flu, I slept on the floor to give him space to rest. I believed that kind of devotion would be returned in its own quiet way. The truth is, I had built my world around him, around our marriage, around the idea that if I gave enough, I would always have a place. And for a long time, I thought I did. But as I sat in the back of that funeral, watching Vanessa smirk while people whispered around her, I realized something that had been building for years. I had been living in the comfort of my own illusion, and that illusion was beginning to crack. It was a Saturday in early spring, one of those rare days when the house felt light and quiet, and Thomas seemed almost like his old self. Vanessa was visiting for the weekend. She had driven in from the city and brought along a bottle of expensive wine that she never actually shared. She always had a way of making even the kindest gesture feel like a performance. I had spent the whole afternoon cooking: roasted chicken, garlic mashed potatoes, the green beans Thomas liked with toasted almonds. I even made the lemon pie he used to request on his birthday. I wanted the evening to feel like a family moment, one of those dinners where memories are made. I set the table with our wedding china, lit 2 white candles, and placed fresh tulips in the middle. They arrived an hour late. Vanessa walked in wearing sunglasses, even though the sun had already set. She gave me a quick glance, mumbled, "Hey," and stepped past me to hug her father. He lit up like a boy, his arms wrapped tightly around her. I stood there with a dish towel still in my hands, the oven beeping behind me, and watched him melt in her arms. During dinner, Vanessa talked about a real estate investment she was making with her fiancé. She never asked about our lives, never commented on the meal, never even acknowledged the pie. Thomas listened to her like every word was a miracle. He barely looked at me. I poured myself a glass of water and stayed quiet, as I had learned to do. Then she said something I will never forget. She looked right at Thomas and asked, "So, how have you survived all these years in suburbia without going completely dull?" She glanced toward me and smiled like she had just told a harmless joke. Thomas laughed. He didn't correct her. He didn't defend me. He didn't say, "Your stepmother has built this home from the ground up." He didn't say, "She gave up her job to help raise you." He just chuckled and said, "She keeps me sane. God knows someone has to." That moment should have been small, just a tiny, awkward laugh at dinner, but it sliced through me like a knife. Not because of what she said, but because of what he didn't. I cleared the plates after dinner while they sat in the living room talking about stocks and condos and restaurants I'd never been invited to. Vanessa's voice rang out every few seconds. Thomas sounded 10 years younger around her. In the kitchen, I stood at the sink, scrubbing a pot that wasn't even dirty. My hands trembled. My chest was tight. That wasn't the first time Vanessa had said something unkind. It wasn't even the worst, but it was the first time I realized Thomas had stopped protecting me. That night, when they had gone upstairs to look at old photo albums, I sat alone on the back porch with my cup of chamomile tea. The wind was cool and the stars were out. I stared at our garden, the one I had tended every season for 25 years. I thought of how many birthdays I had baked for, how many doctor's appointments I had scheduled, how many nights I had stayed awake beside him during his illness. And I thought about how invisible all of that must have been to them. The next morning, Vanessa left without saying goodbye. I found her linen napkin still folded, untouched. The pie had only one slice taken from it, the one I had served to myself. Later, I asked Thomas if he enjoyed having her visit. He said, "Of course. She's my daughter." I asked. Did it ever occur to you that maybe she doesn't respect me? He shrugged. She just has a strong personality. Don't take it so personally. He kissed my forehead and walked away. That was when something inside me began to shift. I didn't have words for it yet, but it felt like a crack in the wall I had built to keep myself safe. A tiny, splintering crack that would eventually grow into something too big to ignore. I had always assumed I was part of his family. That night, I realized I was just someone who lived in his house. After that dinner, something subtle but irreversible shifted between me and Thomas. It wasn't an argument or a dramatic moment. There was no yelling, no doors slamming, just the slow, creeping sense that I had become a fixture in the background of his life. Reliable, quiet, always there but no longer really seen. The house still functioned. Meals were still cooked. Clothes still folded. Medications sorted. But the warmth had drained out of our routine. He would walk past me in the hallway and murmur something soft, maybe a hey or morning. But his eyes didn't really land on me anymore. It was like I had turned into wallpaper. Familiar, comforting, but unnoticed. The strange part is, I didn't fight it right away. I adjusted. I made excuses. He's tired. Work is stressful. Vanessa has a lot going on. I filled the silence with reasons. I told myself this was what long marriages became. Quiet comfort, not constant connection. But deep down, it started to hurt. He began spending more time in his office with the door shut. When I would knock to bring him tea or a snack, he'd open the door just enough to take the cup, thank me with a distracted smile, then return to his laptop. When I asked what he was working on, he'd just say, Vanessa needed help with something. It was always Vanessa. When she called, he would take the phone upstairs. Sometimes he would walk out into the garden and pace while talking, laughing at jokes I couldn't hear. I'd watch him through the window while washing dishes, wondering when my laughter had stopped mattering. On our anniversary that year, he forgot. I had made reservations at a little Italian place we used to love. I'd even pulled out an old navy dress I hadn't worn in years. When he walked through the door, I was standing there in heels, waiting. He looked surprised. Are we going somewhere? I told him it was our anniversary. He frowned, rubbed his forehead, and said, Oh, right. I got caught up helping Vanessa with her taxes. Rain check? I nodded and smiled because I didn't know what else to do. That night, I sat at our kitchen table and ate pasta alone, while the lasagna I had baked for him cooled in the oven. He never asked about it. Small moments like that started stacking on top of each other like pages in a heavy book. The goodnight kisses became light taps. The conversations became updates. He stopped asking me what I was reading or how my walks had been. I stopped offering. Even when we were in the same room, I felt alone. Sometimes we'd watch television side by side on the couch, and he would scroll through messages on his phone. I'd sneak glances at his screen, hoping I'd see a text from a friend or something funny. It was always Vanessa. The worst part wasn't the neglect. It was the way he didn't notice it was happening. He didn't treat me poorly. He didn't yell or insult. He just didn't see me anymore. I tried to reach out. I bought concert tickets to a jazz band he used to love. He said he had a headache. I suggested a weekend getaway. He said he couldn't be away in case Vanessa needed him. I even wrote him a letter, a handwritten note tucked into his nightstand drawer, pouring my heart out. I never saw it moved or mentioned again. I started spending more time alone. I walked longer at the park. I lingered at the library even after I had retired. I watched the sunset from the back porch without inviting him to join me. I began to keep my pain quiet, folding it into the corners of the house like worn linens I didn't have the strength to replace. My friend Margot noticed. She came by one afternoon and said, "You look tired, Elaine." Not the kind sleep fixes. I smiled and told her I was just adjusting to retirement. She didn't believe me, but she didn't press. The truth is, I was grieving a man who was still alive, and I was grieving a version of myself that had slowly vanished without a trace. I had become someone who served, who supported, who stayed in her lane. And all I wanted, more than anything, was to feel like I mattered again. It happened on a Sunday afternoon during what should have been a simple family gathering. Thomas had organized a small barbecue, just a few neighbors, some of Vanessa's friends, and her fiancé, Trevor. I remember waking up early to clean the patio, arrange the chairs, and marinate the chicken. I even wore a soft yellow dress that Thomas once said made me look sunny. It had been months since he noticed what I wore, but I still held onto small hopes. Sometimes we cling to crumbs because we haven't eaten in so long. By noon, the house was full of voices I didn't recognize. Laughter spilled from the backyard while I moved between the kitchen and grill, refilling drinks, checking sides, picking up empty glasses before they could pile up. No one offered to help. No one asked if I needed anything. Vanessa arrived fashionably late, as always. She walked in without knocking, kissed Thomas on the cheek, and looked right past me. "Smells like you hired a caterer," she said, looking around. "I didn't," I replied gently. She raised her eyebrows and gave a little smirk. "Oh, that's cute." I turned back to the kitchen sink, pretending not to hear the small chuckles behind her. They laughed like I was a harmless old relic trying too hard. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to ruin the afternoon. I kept telling myself to be gracious. Later, I brought out a tray of lemonade. Vanessa and her fiancé were sitting at the patio table with a few friends, talking loudly. As I bent slightly to place the pitcher down, one of her friends asked, "So, are you the housekeeper or the stepmom?" The table erupted in laughter. Trevor said, "Be nice, Melissa." "She's both." I froze. Thomas was sitting nearby, sipping his drink, watching them. He didn't laugh, but he didn't say anything either. He didn't stand up. He didn't put a stop to it. He didn't look at me. I straightened up slowly, felt the heat rise in my chest, and turned away without a word. I walked back inside, placed the tray down on the kitchen counter, and stood there, hands pressed against the edge of the sink. My heart pounded. Not because of what they said. I had heard worse in whispers, in glances. What broke me was Thomas's silence, his refusal to claim me as someone worthy of basic respect, his choice to let them mock me, not just as a wife, but as a woman who had given so much of herself. I went to the bathroom and closed the door quietly. I stared at myself in the mirror, my hair frizzing from the heat, mascara smudged at the corners of my eyes. I didn't cry. I just looked. I looked at the woman I had become, the helper, the shadow, the one who made sure everything ran smoothly so everyone else could shine. Later that evening, as the guests left and the sun began to set, Thomas came inside. He didn't mention what happened. He asked if I had more barbecue sauce. That was it. Not a word about the joke, not an ounce of discomfort in his voice. He acted as though I had imagined the entire thing. Maybe, in his world, that was easier. Maybe it was simpler to pretend my silence meant I was fine. But I wasn't fine. That night, I didn't set the table for dinner. I didn't ask if he wanted tea. I went to bed without saying goodnight. He didn't follow me upstairs. He stayed on the couch, watching a late game. In the quiet of our bedroom, I lay under the covers, eyes wide open. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I was something else, something deeper and harder to define. I felt hollow, like a photograph left out in the sun too long, faded. The next morning, I packed up the yellow dress and dropped it in the donation bag. I didn't want to wear anything anymore that reminded me of being ignored. That barbecue was the moment I knew something inside me had broken. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in that quiet, permanent way that changes you forever. It wasn't a single incident that pushed me out. It was a steady erosion, like water wearing down stone. One morning, I simply realized there was nothing left to hold on to. Thomas had been in and out of the hospital that year. His health was declining. High blood pressure, chronic fatigue, a minor stroke that he downplayed. I took care of him the way I always had. I tracked his medications, kept up with appointments, made bland meals that fit the diet the doctors recommended. I even set alarms throughout the night to check on him. I did it without question. That's what a wife does. Then Vanessa started visiting more frequently. She brought in her own team of decisions. New doctors, new routines, new expectations. She arrived with notebooks and tablets, talked over me during consultations, and never once asked what I thought. I went from caretaker to bystander in a matter of weeks. One afternoon, I returned from the pharmacy to find the living room rearranged. The armchair Thomas always used was gone. In its place was a newer, more modern recliner. Vanessa was directing 2 delivery men as if it were her house. I stood there in the doorway, still holding the paper bag of prescriptions. She looked up and said, "Dad needs better support. That old chair was awful." "That chair was his favorite," I said quietly. "He'll get used to this. Trust me." That was the day I stopped arguing. Not because I agreed, but because I could feel how pointless it was. I was a ghost in my own home. Then came the moment that finally broke the surface. I had spent the morning tending to Thomas, his breakfast, his meds, his bath. When Vanessa arrived, she told me to go get some rest. It sounded like kindness, but her voice carried something colder underneath. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed. I could hear them downstairs, her loud voice explaining some new supplement, Thomas murmuring agreement. Then, as I passed the top of the stairs to return with the medication schedule I had written, I heard Vanessa's voice rise, clear and cutting. "She means well, but honestly, Dad, she's more of a burden now. You don't need to worry about her. I can handle everything." I froze. There was a pause. Then Thomas said, "I know. It's just complicated." Not once did he defend me. Not once did he remind her that I had been the one caring for him while she was busy building condos and socializing. He let her words stand. I didn't walk down the stairs. I turned, went back into the bedroom, closed the door, and sat in silence. That evening, I told him I was going to stay with my nephew Greg for a few days. He didn't ask why. He just said, "Let me know if you need anything." Need anything. I had needed so much for so long, and he had never noticed. Greg welcomed me with open arms. He had a guest room that faced the backyard, with soft light in the mornings and a warm comforter on the bed. His house smelled like cinnamon and cedar. He didn't ask for explanations. He just made me tea and let me sit. I stayed 3 days, then 5. Then a week passed and no one from the house called. Not Thomas, not Vanessa. It was as if I had been quietly erased, and no one missed the space I once filled. During that time, I started to realize how empty I had become. I had spent decades serving a life that no longer saw me. I had mistaken routine for love and obligation for belonging. One afternoon, I stood in Greg's kitchen, folding laundry, and I looked out the window. There was a small robin on the fence, just sitting still, then lifting off with sudden grace. I watched it rise into the sky and felt something in my chest unlock. I wasn't angry, I wasn't bitter, I was just done. I didn't call Thomas, I didn't send a letter, I didn't demand anything. I just stayed where I was. I started reading again. I took long walks without needing to be home by a certain time. I laughed, not loudly, but enough that Greg noticed and said, "It's good to see you coming back." He was right. I had walked away quietly, shattered and invisible. But somewhere deep inside, something small and solid was still alive, and it was beginning to breathe again. There's a certain silence that fills a room when you realize no one is coming to find you. No one is wondering where you've gone, or why. It's not the peace of solitude. It's the ache of being forgotten. Greg's guest room became my shelter. At first, it felt temporary. A pause, a breath, a place to gather myself before going back. But the longer I stayed, the more I understood that there was nothing left to return to. What used to feel like home had become something colder, a structure, a history. Not a place of love. Greg was kind. He gave me space, never questioned why I was still there. But even his kindness couldn't stop the weight pressing on my chest every morning. I began to wake earlier and earlier, Not from energy, but from dread. I'd lie still in bed, staring at the ceiling and think, this is it. This is where I landed after everything. I had no job, no home of my own, no children, no family checking in. I had spent decades pouring myself into Thomas's world, and now that I was outside it, I had nothing to hold. One afternoon, I decided to visit the house. I didn't tell Greg. I drove the familiar route slowly, hands tight on the steering wheel. I hadn't been back since the day I left. The garden I once tended looked overgrown. The front window had new curtains. Vanessa's taste. Modern, cold. I sat in the car for a while. Then I saw Vanessa step out onto the porch with a cup of coffee in one hand and her phone in the other. She was laughing. She didn't notice me. She didn't look around. She stood on my porch, on the bricks I had scrubbed every spring, in the doorway where I had waited for Thomas so many times, and she looked perfectly at home. I drove away before she saw me. My chest felt hollow. I pulled over at a gas station 5 minutes later and cried harder than I had in years. I bent forward in the driver's seat, sobbing into my hands, not caring who saw. It wasn't about the house. It wasn't even about Vanessa. It was about realizing I had been erased. I thought of the lemon pie I baked every year, the quilts I folded at the foot of Thomas's bed, the letters I wrote him when he was sick, the birthday cards Vanessa never opened, the Christmas mornings I spent alone while they laughed upstairs. None of it had anchored me in their lives. I was background. I went back to Greg's and didn't speak much that night. He asked if I wanted dinner. I shook my head. I sat on the back porch and watched the wind move through the trees. Everything felt heavy. My body, my mind, even the air. I tried to remember the last time someone had looked at me with real love. Not politeness, not obligation, just love. I couldn't. That night, I had a dream. I was walking through a house, but all the furniture was covered in white sheets. The walls were blank. I opened doors and found nothing behind them. Room after room, empty. I woke up gasping. I got out of bed, walked barefoot into the kitchen, and stood by the window, staring out into the darkness. I could see my reflection faintly in the glass. My hair was unbrushed. My eyes were swollen. I didn't look like myself. I didn't know who I was anymore. That was the bottom. Not one dramatic fall. Just the slow realization that I had disappeared into other people's lives for so long that I had forgotten my own. I whispered to myself, "You have to start over." The words felt foreign in my mouth, but they were true. No one was coming to fix it. No one was going to save me. I had to save myself. I placed my palm on the window, felt the coolness of the glass. It was time to stop hoping someone would remember me. It was time to remember myself. It started with a box. Greg had asked if I wanted to sort through some of my things. When I left Thomas's house, I had only taken a suitcase and my purse. The rest, keepsakes, documents, photo albums, had been packed by Vanessa and sent over without a note. The boxes had been sitting in Greg's garage for weeks, unopened. I wasn't ready. But one morning, I woke before dawn, restless and unable to fall back asleep. The house was quiet. I made myself a cup of tea, wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, and went into the garage. The air was cool, and the scent of cardboard and dust wrapped around me like memory. The first box held familiar things, my favorite mugs, a chipped dish from our first anniversary, a few old scarves. Beneath them, I found a photo of me and Thomas on the beach in Maine. We had taken the trip for our 10th anniversary. I remember how windy it was, how he had held my hand the entire walk down the pier. I stared at the picture for a long time, wondering how we had gotten so far from that version of us. I moved to the next box. This one was heavier. Inside were old tax folders, medical records, and envelopes from the bank. I sifted through them slowly until I found one labeled simply, "Trust Documents, Elaine." I paused. The handwriting was unmistakably Thomas's, careful and slightly slanted with that extra loop he always put on his lowercase e. My hands began to tremble as I lifted the folder. Inside was a typed document, neatly clipped together. Attached to the front was a note written on lined paper in pen. Elaine, in case something happens, this is for you. You deserve to have something that's yours. Thank you for everything. Thomas. My throat tightened. I set the letter down and began reading the document. It was a legal trust, dated nearly 5 years earlier. It stated without ambiguity that upon Thomas's death, full ownership of our marital home would transfer solely to me, not to Vanessa, not to the estate, to me. It was notarized, signed, legal. I sat there for a long time, reading it over and over. A part of me felt stunned. Another part, deeper, older, more tired, felt something even heavier. Relief. Not because of the house, though the security of it mattered more now than ever, but because it meant he had seen me. Maybe not with loud words or grand gestures, but he had known, on some level, what I had given, what I had carried, and he had tried to leave me something more than silence. Still, it hurt. Why hadn't he told me? Why had he let me walk away feeling so small? Why had he stayed quiet while his daughter erased me? I walked back inside with the folder pressed against my chest. Greg was pouring cereal at the kitchen counter. He looked up and saw my face. "You okay?" I nodded, then shook my head. I found something. We sat down at the table and I showed him the letter. He read it slowly, then looked at me with soft, steady eyes. He knew, Aunt Elaine. He might not have said it right, but he knew. I pressed my lips together and exhaled through my nose, trying not to cry again. I had spent so long wondering if I had imagined everything, if my place in that house, in that marriage, had only existed in my head. This document, this folded letter, was proof that I hadn't been invisible. I had mattered. I went back to the garage later that day searching for more. I found more folders, more envelopes, but none as meaningful, just standard paperwork. But the trust was enough. It was more than I had expected. That night, I slept deeper than I had in months, not because the pain was gone, but because something inside me had shifted. I felt grounded again, not in someone else's life, in my own. I had the right to that house. The legal right, yes, but also the emotional one. I had built it. I had poured my life into it, and now it was mine. I didn't know yet what I was going to do, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had a choice. It didn't happen all at once. There was no lightning bolt moment, no fiery speech or bold decision. It was quieter than that, more internal, like the slow return of sensation after a limb falls asleep. The morning after I found the trust document, I woke early. The house was still dark, the world outside barely hinting at dawn. I sat on the edge of the bed, the cool wooden floor beneath my feet, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in months. Something was different. The sadness was still there, but it had shifted. It wasn't consuming me. It was beside me now. Something I could walk with, not drown in. I dressed and made tea. I sat by Greg's window and watched the light rise across the yard. A squirrel darted across the fence. A bird landed near the edge of the garden, pecking at seeds. Life, small and steady, continued, and I was still here. I was part of it. Later that day, I drove myself to the library. I hadn't stepped into one in over a year, not since I'd retired. The smell of paper and wood polish hit me the second I walked in, and something in my chest ached in a good way. I wandered the aisles slowly, running my fingers along the spines of books I'd once shelved and recommended. I picked up a novel I had loved years ago, sat in a corner, and read for hours. No one was waiting on me. No one needed anything. I wasn't a caretaker in that moment. I was just a woman in a library remembering who she used to be. The next day, I went for a walk in the park. I wore a coat I hadn't put on since the last winter with Thomas. I used to rush through walks, always mindful of when he'd want dinner or if he'd need something from the pharmacy. But now, I walked slowly. I I stopped to watch a group of children feed ducks. I listened to the crunch of leaves beneath my shoes. At one point, I passed a couple sitting on a bench, holding hands. The woman had white hair pulled into a bun. The man was reading aloud from a folded newspaper. They looked content, peaceful. I didn't feel envious, I didn't feel bitter, I felt still. I began to reclaim little things. I cooked for myself not because anyone was hungry, but because I missed the rhythm of preparing food I actually enjoyed. I played music while I cleaned. I opened old journals and reread entries from years ago. I was surprised to find how many times I had written about loneliness. Even in the early years of my marriage, it was there, quiet, constant. I just hadn't let myself acknowledge it. One afternoon, I met Margot for coffee. I hadn't seen her in weeks. She hugged me tightly when I arrived. "You look better," she said, searching my face. "Lighter?" I nodded. "I feel like I'm waking up from something I didn't know I was sleeping through." We talked for hours. I told her about the trust, about the letter, about the silence Thomas left behind. She didn't offer platitudes, she just listened. "I think I forgot I existed outside of him," I said at one point. "I don't want to go back to that." "You don't have to," she said. "You're allowed to begin again." That night, I sat down and made a list. Nothing grand, just small things I wanted to do. Things I had put off for years. Things I thought were selfish ones. Take a painting class. Visit the coast again. Host a dinner for friends. Start a garden somewhere new. And at the bottom, I wrote, "Take back what's mine." It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about the house. It was about honoring the version of me that had survived. The woman who had spent years giving, serving, loving, and who was finally ready to choose herself. I folded the list and tucked it into the notebook I now carried with me. A small, quiet promise. I was no longer invisible, not to the world, not to myself. And that was where it started, the real beginning. Once I decided I wasn't going back to being invisible, I began making plans, but I told no one. There was no announcement, no confrontation. I didn't call Vanessa. I didn't write a letter to Thomas's side of the family. I didn't even tell Margot, though I suspect she saw it forming in my eyes during our last coffee. I simply began to move, quietly, deliberately, as a woman who had finally realized she had nothing left to lose and everything to regain. The first thing I did was call an attorney. Not the kind Vanessa had paraded around, but someone local, quiet, and thorough. I brought him the trust documents, the letter Thomas had written, and copies of the deed to the house. He read through them with measured calm, flipping each page carefully before nodding. "You're the legal beneficiary of the house," he said plainly. "Vanessa may not like it, but the law is clear. It's yours." Something about the way he said it, direct, unshaken, gave me courage. He offered to begin the paperwork immediately to transfer the title fully into my name and prepare notices of occupancy change, if needed. I nodded, signed the forms, and walked out of his office standing a little straighter. Next, I visited the bank. I hadn't looked at the joint accounts in months. Vanessa had insisted on taking over after Thomas's health declined, and like a fool, I let her. I believed then that she was helping. But now I could see the pattern more clearly. The banker looked confused when I introduced myself. "There's a note on the account to notify Ms. Harper, Vanessa, about any changes." I smiled politely. "That will no longer be necessary. I'm the surviving spouse. Here's the trust and death certificate." The banker's face shifted, apologetic, respectful. He updated the file. I walked out with full access and a certified copy of everything. I didn't touch a cent. I just needed control back. Not over the money, over my life. From there, I started gathering the pieces I had left behind. I went back to the house once, during the day when I knew Vanessa would be out. I rang the bell, though I didn't need to. I still had a key. No one answered. I let myself in. It was surreal stepping into a space that used to be mine, now rearranged to erase me. The walls had been painted. New art hung in the hallway. My curtains had been replaced with modern shades. And yet, as I walked from room to room, I noticed the details they hadn't touched. The dent in the baseboard where Thomas had dropped a suitcase. The scratches on the kitchen table from when we assembled furniture together. The faint scent of the lavender cleaner I always used in the upstairs bathroom. My presence hadn't disappeared. It had just been buried. I stood in our old bedroom for a long time. The bed was covered in throw pillows I didn't recognize. My nightstand was gone. But when I opened the closet, my robe was still hanging on a forgotten hook behind the door. I took it with me. Before I left, I went to the back porch. The garden was wild now, overgrown and unloved. I knelt down and touched the edge of the soil. I whispered a quiet promise to myself. This will be mine again. Not because I need it to be, but because I earned it. Over the next week, I finalized the paperwork, changed the locks through the attorney's firm, notified the city utilities. Every move I made was quiet, legal, careful. I wasn't trying to cause chaos. I wasn't out for revenge. I was restoring what was always meant to be mine. Vanessa hadn't contacted me since the funeral. Not a message, not a call. I knew she thought I had disappeared for good. I let her keep thinking that. Until the day the certified letter arrived at her door, informing her that the property she had made herself at home in now legally belonged to me, and that she had 30 days to vacate or submit a formal lease agreement. I didn't write the letter. I didn't need to. By then, my silence had become its own kind of power. I didn't see Vanessa's reaction when the certified letter arrived, but I can imagine it. She would have opened it quickly, probably expecting a routine bank update or some estate paperwork she believed was under her control. She wouldn't have expected a legal notice. She wouldn't have expected my name, stamped and signed at the bottom, reclaiming the house she now called home. She hadn't heard from me since the funeral. I had said nothing to her. She probably thought I had slinked away in humiliation. She never did understand the strength in quiet women. I didn't wait for a phone call or a knock at my door. I didn't prepare for a confrontation. I simply carried on with my life, letting the wheels I had set in motion continue to turn. It was a strange feeling, this quiet power. For so long, I had moved through the world with my shoulders drawn in, trying not to take up space, trying not to disrupt. Now I moved with calm certainty. I didn't need to explain myself. I didn't owe anyone a performance. People began to notice the change, even Greg. "You seem different lately," he said one morning over breakfast, "like you're in control again." I smiled. I am. I started cooking again, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I filled the kitchen with smells that reminded me of who I was before all of this. Cinnamon toast, roasted rosemary potatoes, chicken soup from scratch, the kind of meals that made a house feel alive. One afternoon, I drove to a nursery and picked out plants for a new garden. It wouldn't be large, just a few herbs, some lavender, maybe tomatoes if the soil allowed. I carried the pots to my car myself. No one offered help, and I didn't need it. The shift wasn't just happening inside me, it was happening around me. Margot invited me to speak at her women's circle. "You don't have to share the whole story," she said. "Just talk about starting over." I was hesitant, but I went. I stood in front of 15 women, some older, some younger, and told them about losing yourself without ever realizing it. I told them how easy it is to give until nothing's left. And I told them that coming back from that isn't loud or glamorous. It's slow, it's daily, it's small, repeated acts of choosing yourself. Afterward, one woman came up to me in tears. She said, "You just described my marriage." We hugged. We didn't need to say anything else. Back at Greg's, I received an email from my lawyer. Vanessa had responded. The tone was terse, formal. She questioned the validity of the trust, claimed she was acting in her father's best interest, said she deserved a say in what happened to the house. My attorney replied on my behalf, attaching the signed, notarized documents and reaffirming my legal ownership. He told her plainly, She could either vacate or submit a formal lease request. She chose silence. 2 days later, her car was gone from the driveway. The security footage, now routed to my phone, showed movers loading furniture into a truck. She didn't leave a note. She didn't call. She didn't try to see me. I watched it all happen from Greg's kitchen, sipping coffee. The house was mine again, not just in title, in presence. Not because I demanded it, not because I shouted or begged, but because I did the work in silence. I did it carefully, thoughtfully, in the name of every forgotten dinner, every erased kindness, every moment I sat at a table and watched people pretend I wasn't there. The silence that used to haunt me had become something else, something powerful. It wasn't absence, it was presence, held with intention. Vanessa may have laughed at me in that funeral parlor, but now I held the keys, and I hadn't even raised my voice. It wasn't dramatic. That's the part that surprises people when I tell the story now. There was no screaming, no threats, no scene in the driveway. It was quiet, and that made it even more powerful. I waited 2 weeks after Vanessa moved out. I didn't rush back into the house. I needed time, not just for the paperwork to clear, but for my spirit to settle. I wanted to walk through that front door not as someone who had been discarded, but as someone who had chosen herself. On a mild Thursday morning, I put on a soft linen blouse, one I had never worn in that house before. It was pale blue, the color of calm skies. I brushed my hair, slipped on flats, and drove to what was once my home, and now officially mine again. As I parked outside, I noticed the absence. Her SUV was gone. The porch, once cluttered with Vanessa's packages and shoes, was bare. The blinds were closed. There were no potted plants by the steps, no welcome mat. The house looked like it had exhaled. I stepped inside slowly. The air was stale, like it had been holding its breath. Boxes were gone, furniture stripped down. She had taken anything she could claim as hers, and in doing so, she left the bones of what I had built. The hardwood floors I chose, the paint I rolled on the walls one summer when Thomas had the flu, the shelves I lined with books. It was all still there, just waiting. I walked through each room with steady feet. I didn't cry, I didn't smile, I just observed. In the bedroom, my robe still hung on the back of the closet door. In the kitchen, my old measuring cups were tucked in the wrong drawer. I made a mental note to move them back. Then the doorbell rang. I hadn't expected anyone. I thought maybe it was a neighbor or someone dropping off mail addressed to Thomas. But when I opened the door, Vanessa stood there. She looked tired. Her hair was pulled back, face free of makeup, eyes dark with whatever she hadn't said. "Can we talk?" she asked. I stepped aside without a word and let her in. She walked straight to the living room and stood near the fireplace where Thomas used to hang stockings. I stayed by the door. "I didn't know," she said. "About the trust. About the letter. He never told me." I said nothing. I just thought, he always promised me the house would come to me, that this place would be mine. Her voice didn't hold anger. It held confusion. The kind that comes when the ground under you shifts and no one warned you it was coming. "He also promised me a lot of things," I said, my voice steady, "but promises don't mean much if you only keep them in whispers." She looked down, and for a moment I saw her not as the woman who mocked me, not as the daughter who pushed me aside, but as someone who had been living inside her own illusion, just like I had for years. "He wrote the trust 5 years ago," I continued. "That means he made that decision while he was still healthy, and he left me a note. It wasn't long, but it was clear. He wanted me to have this house." Vanessa shifted on her feet. "You could have told me." I looked at her. "You didn't ask. You never asked me anything. You assumed I would disappear." She didn't argue. She just stood there, nodding slowly. "I'll come back next week for the last of my things," she said. "I left a box in the garage." "You can do that," I replied. "Just let me know the day." She turned to leave, then paused. I really thought he loved me more. I met her eyes. Maybe he did, but that doesn't mean he loved me less. She left without another word. I didn't collapse in tears. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt clear, like a long-held fog had finally lifted. The reveal wasn't about ownership. It wasn't about proving her wrong. It was about reclaiming the truth of my place. I had always been here. She had just refused to see me. Now she had no choice. Vanessa never came back for the box in the garage. A week passed, then 2. I gave her the time she said she needed, even left the side gate unlocked in case she preferred to collect it without facing me again. But the box stayed right where it was, on the shelf near Thomas's old workbench, collecting dust. At first, I debated whether to call her, but something told me not to. She had said her piece. I had said mine. Some doors don't need to be reopened. It was around that time that I received a second envelope from the attorney. I almost didn't open it right away. I assumed it was just a final statement or follow-up paperwork for the trust. But when I unfolded the letter, my hands began to tremble. It was another will. Apparently, months before his death, Thomas had drawn up a second, more personal document, one that was never mentioned at the reading Vanessa had arranged, possibly because it had been filed separately. The attorney only discovered it while closing out Thomas's private records. This one hadn't gone through his daughter's legal team. It had been quietly prepared and stored in a locked drawer in his office, under my name. Inside were a few handwritten notes and legal addendums. He had not only left me the house, he had also transferred all personal belongings within it, furniture, jewelry, heirlooms, and a separate savings account he had kept hidden from the family. It wasn't an enormous amount, but it was substantial enough to make a difference. But it was what he wrote at the bottom that struck me still. Elaine, if you're reading this, then I'm already gone. And if I'm honest, I don't deserve the peace you'll bring to this house now. But I hope you take it. I hope you fill it again, with your voice, your books, your strength. Thank you for standing by me longer than I probably earned. This is yours. I meant it, always. I sat at the kitchen table, the letter open in front of me, my tea untouched beside it. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just breathed. It wasn't about money. It wasn't even about the house anymore. It was about validation. After years of being treated like the background character in my own life, here was written proof, from the man who had once failed to stand up for me, that I had mattered, that he had seen me, even if too late. I filed the paperwork with the lawyer, added the account to my records, and placed the letter in a drawer of my own, not out of bitterness, out of quiet acknowledgement. It was a piece of the story that had finally been told. The real twist came later, when I bumped into Vanessa again at a charity event. It was one of those formal spring luncheons at a local art gallery. Margot had invited me, not knowing Vanessa would be there too. The moment our eyes met across the room, something shifted. She was standing by the hors d'oeuvres table, dressed in black, her posture stiff. She looked thinner. Her fiancé was nowhere in sight. She didn't approach me immediately. In fact, she looked like she might leave. But instead, after a long pause, she walked over. I read the letter, she said quietly. I tilted my head. What letter? The one he wrote you. I found a copy. I didn't know he had written something like that. I stayed silent, waiting. She shifted uncomfortably. I think he wanted to make things right. I think he did the best he could, I replied, in his own way. She looked down. I guess I owe you an apology. I nodded once. You do, but I'm not waiting for it. That seemed to land somewhere deeper than she expected. Her eyes welled, but she blinked them clear. I won't bother you again, she said. I just wanted you to know that. I watched her walk away and felt no triumph, only peace. Because final justice doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like truth finally spoken. Sometimes it's just the weight of years being lifted by a few honest words and the power of walking away on your own terms. That was the moment the story turned completely. Not when I got the house, not when I read the letter, but when she saw me, not as a burden or a placeholder, but as a woman she could no longer ignore. And I didn't need to say another word. It had been almost 3 months since I'd last seen Vanessa when the card arrived. Not a text, not an email. A handwritten card in a cream-colored envelope with no return address, just my name and the house's street number written neatly across the front. For a moment, I thought it might be from a neighbor. But when I opened it and saw the careful cursive, I recognized her handwriting instantly. It read, "Elaine, I know I've said too little, too late. I'm not expecting anything from you. I just want you to know I've started therapy. I'm trying to understand the ways I've hurt people who only ever wanted peace. I hope the house feels lighter now. I hope you do too. Vanessa." There was no signature beyond her name, no apology written outright. But the note didn't need many words. The tone of it was quieter than the woman I had known, and more honest. I folded the card and placed it on the counter. I didn't rush to respond. I didn't know if I even would. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel obligated to fix or nurture or carry the weight of someone else's guilt. Still, her message lingered with me. A week later, I was tending the garden. I had cleared the overgrowth, trimmed back the roses, and planted lavender along the back edge of the yard. It was beginning to bloom, and the air carried its scent through the open windows. I stood there with my gloves on, a trowel in one hand, and thought about how much I had changed since walking away from the life I once clung to. Then I saw her. Vanessa was standing just outside the gate, unsure if she should come closer. She wore jeans and a simple cardigan, nothing like the sharply tailored clothes I used to see her in. Her hands were tucked into her sleeves, and her shoulders looked small, like she was bracing for rejection. I didn't say anything. I didn't wave her in. I waited. She hesitated, then slowly opened the gate and stepped inside. "I didn't want to come uninvited," she said. "You didn't," I replied. "You sent a card." She gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. I wasn't sure if it was the right thing. I dusted off my gloves and nodded. Right things look different when you're not trying to win. We stood in silence for a moment. She glanced around the yard. "It looks beautiful," she said, "like it used to." "It feels like it used to," I said, "and better." Vanessa stepped closer, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. "I didn't know how to talk to you when I was younger. I was angry, and I blamed you for things that weren't yours to carry. I see that now." I nodded, not out of agreement, but acknowledgement. She looked down at the dirt, kicked at a small stone with her shoe. "I don't expect anything. I just wanted you to know I'm trying to be better." I gestured toward the bench near the garden path. "Sit for a bit if you want." She looked surprised, then grateful, and followed me over. We sat side by side on the bench, the breeze carrying a soft rustle through the trees. For a long while, we didn't speak. The silence wasn't heavy. It was the kind that can only exist between two people who are done pretending. Eventually, she turned to me and said, "I don't think I ever gave you a real chance. And I think I missed out because of it." "I think we both missed a lot," I said. "But what matters is what we do with what's left." She nodded. "Would it be okay if I checked in sometimes?" I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I said, "You can try." That was enough. When she left, I didn't feel tense or unsettled. I didn't replay the conversation in my head, wondering if I had said too much or too little. I simply went back to my garden, slipped on my gloves, and returned to planting. The soil felt soft beneath my hands. For the first time in years, I was building something that was only mine. And if she wanted to walk alongside it, carefully occasionally, I could make room. Not because I needed her to, but because I didn't need her approval anymore. I had found peace, and I was choosing to protect it. I woke up to sunlight spilling across the hardwood floor, warmer than it had felt in years. The morning light touched everything gently, the curtains I had sewn by hand, the side table Thomas once carved for me, the small stack of books I now allowed myself to read without guilt. I brewed my tea without rushing. The clink of the spoon against the mug felt like a familiar rhythm, no longer echoing in a house that had once felt too quiet. I stepped out to the garden, barefoot, letting the earth cool my soles. The lavender had grown taller. Bees hovered lazily near the blooms. Birds flitted through the trees, free and unbothered. This wasn't the house I had lived in for years. It was the same structure, yes, the same roof, the same windows. But it had become something new, something softer, something honest. It had become mine. Not because of the title, not even because of Thomas's letter or the lawyer's stamp. It became mine the moment I reclaimed myself inside it, the moment I stopped asking for permission to exist within my own walls. I wandered to the edge of the garden where a bench now sat under the magnolia tree. I had placed it there weeks ago, after the final legal filings were complete. I needed a place to sit, to breathe, to witness the life I was rebuilding. I brought the box with me, the one with all the notes Thomas had written me over the years, birthday cards, little scraps he left on the counter, the letter that came with the trust. I spread them across my lap, letting the breeze rustle the edges. He had failed me in many ways. He had let me feel invisible, had allowed others to humiliate me without standing in their way. But he had also left me these words, this house, this quiet admission that I had mattered more than he ever said out loud. I didn't need to forgive him to feel peace. I didn't need to hold on to pain to feel power. I just needed to tell the truth, to myself most of all. I thought back to who I was at the beginning of all this. A woman who thought being patient was the same as being loved. A woman who gave and gave until her own name began to disappear in the giving. I looked at her with compassion now, not pity. She didn't know better, but she survived long enough to learn. I placed the notes back in the box and set it on the bench beside me. Then I looked out over the garden. So much had grown, and so much still would. In the weeks since Vanessa's visit, she had sent 2 more cards. Short ones. No apologies. Just updates. She mentioned she was moving into a small apartment downtown. She had adopted a rescue dog. She was thinking about volunteering. I hadn't responded yet. I didn't know if I would. But I didn't feel cold toward her. I just felt clear. Some people arrive in your life to teach you boundaries. Some stay too long. Some leave without warning. And some, like Vanessa, circle back, not for redemption, but because time has softened the edges of their ego. I had made peace with all of it. I stood from the bench, brushed the soil from my hands, and walked back inside. The home welcomed me, not as someone's wife, not as someone's stepmother, but as a whole woman who had finally made space for herself. I paused in the entryway and looked at the hallway mirror. I didn't look younger, I didn't look stronger, but I looked honest, present, like someone who had fought for peace, not loudly but fully. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes silence is the start of something sacred, a boundary, a decision, a shift, a woman walking away without slamming the door. And then one day, walking back in and locking it behind her, not to keep others out, but to finally let herself stay in for good.